There is something almost darkly comic about the day Louis XVI became King of France. It was June 1775. Weeks before his coronation, the villages surrounding Paris had erupted in riots over the price of bread. Soldiers had to be posted at every road leading to Reims. The innkeepers complained of empty rooms. The banquet managers lamented the mountains of uneaten food. And yet, when the great cathedral doors swung open and a 20-year-old king stepped into the light, crown on his head, the sceptre of Charlemagne in his hand, anointed with the holy oil of Clovis himself, those who were there felt something genuine: awe, reverence, hope. 3 days later, that same king pressed his bare hands to the faces and necks of 2,400 patients, suffering from scrofula, a disfiguring disease of the skin and lymph nodes, because centuries of tradition held that the sacred touch of an anointed king could heal them. That image tells you almost everything you need to know about France in 1789. A kingdom of genuine grandeur and genuine squalor, a system of breathtaking sophistication that somehow could not feed its own people. A civilization that had produced Voltaire, Rousseau, and the Enlightenment, and yet still required its monarch to cure disease with his fingertips. The revolution that would erupt 14 years later was not a sudden accident. It was the inevitable settling of a debt that France had been running up for generations. And to understand it, you have to understand the kingdom it destroyed. So let's go back. Let's walk through France together, all of it, before the fires start. Chapter 1. The Kingdom on the Eve of Everything. France in the 1770s was, by almost any measure, the most powerful country in Europe. It had a population of more than 27 million, and growing. Its territory stretched across nearly 300,000 square miles. Its roads were the finest on the continent. Foreign visitors marvelled at them. Its army, though recently humiliated in the 7 Years' War, was still formidable. Its navy was being rebuilt at enormous expense. Its cultural prestige was unrivaled. French was the language of every court in Europe, from Madrid to St. Petersburg. And yet, underneath all of that, France was a kingdom that barely worked. Picture a map. Not a modern, clean, colour-coded political map, but something messier. Something that looks like it was drawn by a committee of feuding medieval clerks who then handed it to their grandchildren to revise, who then handed it to their grandchildren, who added a few regions, changed a few boundaries, and ultimately produced something that no single person fully understood. That was France. The kingdom was divided into provinces, roughly 39 of them, though historians genuinely disagree on the exact count, because the traditions defining them were so old and tangled that nobody could say for certain where one ended and another began. These provinces had been absorbed into the French crown over centuries, each through its own negotiated terms. Some had their own regional parliaments, called parliaments, with the power to block royal edicts. Some had their own separate tax systems. Some had their own customary laws, their own weights and measures, their own courts. A single piece of goods travelling from eastern France to the Mediterranean coast might pass through 36 different toll checkpoints, some royal, some privately owned, each with its own tariff schedule, each exacting its own cut. A trader who owned property in 2 different provinces might find that the inheritance laws governing those properties were entirely contradictory. A man could be tried for the same crime under different rules depending entirely on which side of an invisible jurisdictional line the offence took place. In the south, Roman law prevailed. In the north, customary law was king, but there were at least 65 versions of it, each with dozens of local variations. The salt tax alone was administered in 6 different tiers, with 6 entire regions exempt from it entirely. The main income tax, the taille, was assessed on individuals in some areas and on land in others, which meant that a nobleman living in certain regions actually paid taxes while his neighbour, a commoner who happened to own an old feudal estate, did not. To any rational observer, and France in the 18th century was full of people who considered themselves rational observers, this looked like chaos. It was the accumulated sediment of 1,000 years of conquest, negotiation, compromise, and accident. Never swept clean, never rationalised, just added to, layer upon layer, until the whole structure groaned under its own weight. If you had walked France in the 1780s, as the English agricultural writer Arthur Young actually did, writing everything down with the meticulous horror of a man who couldn't believe what he was seeing, you would have moved through a landscape of staggering contrasts. In the Paris Basin, you would have found the richest agricultural land in the kingdom. The Seine and Loire river systems made transportation easy. The roads radiated outward from the capital like spokes from a wheel. The literacy rate was higher here than anywhere else in France. The farms were productive. The textile mills around Rouen employed hundreds of thousands of workers. Foreign visitors called it the Manchester of France. But ride 150 miles in almost any direction and everything changes. Go west into Brittany and you enter a different world entirely. A landscape of hedgerows and sunken lanes, a people who speak Breton rather than French, a coastline facing the Atlantic that connects them more naturally to the wider ocean than to Paris. Young wrote that Brittany, along with Maine and Anjou, looked like a desert. He was not entirely right. Brittany's population was actually healthy, its taxes relatively light, its people fiercely proud of their regional autonomy. But the poverty was real. The roads around the region of the Vendée, that low, wet, landlocked country south of the Loire, were so bad that the major traffic routes avoided it entirely. It was one of the most isolated regions in France, and it would remember that isolation in ways nobody could yet predict. Go south, past the Loire, past the vast open plain of the Beauce, and the world becomes warmer and stranger. You cross into the territory of a different language, not French in the northern sense, but the Languedoc, the speech of the south, which sounded to northern ears almost like Italian or Spanish. In Provence, the summers are burning and dry. In Languedoc, 250,000 Protestants live in the shadow of memories of persecution, of the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685 that stripped them of legal protection, of the bloody Camisard revolt that set Protestant farmers against royal armies in the early decades of the century. A Protestant pastor had been executed as recently as 1762. The trauma had not healed. Go east, toward the Rhine, and you find Alsace, a province that has been formerly French for barely a century, whose people mostly speak German, whose Protestant communities were protected by international treaty. Beside it, Lorraine, French-controlled only since 1766, with 30,000 Jewish residents scattered across its hills. These border regions feel less like heartland than like recent acquisitions, territories that haven't quite decided they're French yet. Go to the mountains south, the massif central, the high spine of France, and you find a land that seems to belong to a different century. People here survive by seasonal migration, coming down from the heights in winter to find work in the lowlands. They eat chestnuts because grain doesn't grow reliably enough at altitude. Their villages are largely cut off from the commercial networks that pulse through the lowland cities. What you begin to understand, walking through all of this, is that France, in 1789, was not really one country. It was several dozen countries wearing the same flag, connected by the same monarch, and by an ambitious but deeply uneven road system, speaking perhaps a dozen different languages and dialects, governed by hundreds of different legal traditions, paying taxes at dozens of different rates, and held together by a combination of royal authority, military force, habit, and the slow accumulation of what we might now call national culture, though that phrase would have puzzled most French people if you had said it to them. Here is the statistic that cuts through everything else. In any given year during the reign of Louis XVI, roughly 1/3 of the French population, approximately 8 million people, could be classified as poor, not uncomfortable, not anxious. Poor, as in without reliable work, without sufficient food, dependent on charity or crime or seasonal migration just to survive. In bad years, and there were many bad years, 2 or 3 million additional people crossed over that line. 80% of French people were peasants. The overwhelming majority worked land they did not own, under arrangements that consumed most of what they produced. The great inheritance laws of France, which unlike England required estates to be divided equally among all heirs rather than passed to a single eldest son, had, over generations, fragmented agricultural land into millions of tiny plots, most of them too small to sustain a family. A farmer who owned his land was lucky. A farmer who rented it on a sharecropping agreement, giving half his crop to the landlord in exchange for seed, was more common. A farmer with no land at all, surviving on seasonal labour and odd jobs, was commonest of all. The result was a countryside of desperate ingenuity. In the Auvergne, one church report from 1769 noted that the only trade the residents possessed was spending 9 months of every year away from home, looking for work somewhere else. Families sent their members out to nearby cities, to construction sites, to textile mills, wherever there was something to do, and then brought them back in winter, having converted their labour into whatever cash or food they could carry. The village was not a community of settled farmers. It was a base camp, and even this system was cracking. Through the 18th century, prices had risen 3 times faster than wages. A day labourer in Picardy earned, in real terms, less than his grandfather had earned 50 years before, while the price of bread had doubled. An English visitor in Quercy observed rural women and men without shoes. A Norman priest wrote in 1774 that any working man with 3 children was essentially guaranteed to end up begging. The math simply didn't work. 2 children, difficult. 3, impossible. The cities were not better. They were, if anything, a kind of concentrated despair. Paris had somewhere between 40 and 50,000 domestic servants, the largest single employment category in the capital, and below them, a vast churning mass of day labourers, porters, street vendors, beggars, and those who had given up entirely. 18,000 abandoned children were registered in France in the 1780s, 8,000 of them in Paris alone, left at hospital doors by parents who could not feed another mouth. The hospitals that received these infants sent them to wet nurses in the countryside, most of whom were also desperately poor, and most of the infants did not survive their 5th year. Bread riots were not rare events. They were a regular feature of French life. In 1768, 1770, 1773, 1775, 1778, 1784, 1785. In each case, the pattern was the same. The price of grain spiked, usually after a bad harvest. Crowds gathered at markets, traders were threatened or beaten, granaries were broken into. The just price, the price ordinary people believed bread should cost, was enforced at knife point. In 1775, just weeks before Louis XVI's coronation, the Flower War swept through villages surrounding Paris, reaching the gates of Versailles itself. The army was called out. 2 people were executed. Order was restored, but nothing that caused the disorder was fixed. Now let's talk about the people at the top. France had 3 legal orders: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, who were called the Third Estate. This was not merely a social hierarchy. It was a legal structure with different rights, different obligations, and different relationships to the state's demands. The clergy, about 130,000 people, were the First Estate. They owned more than 1/10 of all French land. They paid no ordinary taxes, instead making periodic free gifts to the crown that they negotiated themselves. They controlled the entire education system, most of the hospitals, and the only public welfare network that existed. They had their own courts, their own administrative structures, their own internal economy, and their upper reaches, all the bishops, the wealthy abbots, the cathedral chapters, were monopolised by the nobility. By 1789, every single bishop in France, save one, was of noble birth. The nobility, perhaps 120,000 to 350,000 people, depending on how you count, were the Second Estate. They owned between 1/4 and 1/3 of all French land. They held virtually every senior position in the army, the navy, the diplomatic corps, and the royal administration. They were exempt from the most hated taxes, including the salt tax and the taille. They had the right to display coats of arms, to wear swords, to be judged in special courts, and, in the event of a capital sentence, to be beheaded rather than hanged, which was considered a more dignified death. But the nobility was not a monolithic group. It was a spectrum that ran from the dazzling heights of Versailles court life to a kind of threadbare gentility that would have been pitied in an English market town. The great ducal families, the Noailles, the Montmorencys, the Condés, moved in a world of incomprehensible luxury, surrounded by hundreds of servants, their lives measured in the currency of royal favour. Below them were the provincial nobles, men who owned a chateau that was falling apart, who sent their sons into the army because there was nothing else to do, who collected feudal dues from peasants who resented every sou, not wealthy by any standard, but fiercely insistent on every prerogative their birth entitled them to. And at the top of the third estate, sandwiched between the mass of the poor and the wall of privilege above them, was the bourgeoisie. These were the lawyers, the merchants, the doctors, the notaries, the educated professionals of France. Their numbers had more than doubled since the reign of Louis XIV. They owned perhaps a fifth of all private wealth. They were building the new theatres, financing the new industries, buying the books that Voltaire and Rousseau were writing. They were, in almost every measurable sense, the most dynamic force in French society, and they were held at arm's length. By law, they could not hold the most prestigious military commissions. The Ségur Ordinance of 1781 required officers to prove 4 generations of noble ancestry. They were excluded from the senior judicial positions in many parliaments. They watched as men of older, bluer blood, who often had far less education, far less ability, and far less energy, were handed the positions that ought, by any rational metric, to have gone to them. The response of ambitious bourgeois men was predictable and psychologically revealing. They tried to become nobles. They bought offices that came with hereditary nobility attached. They fabricated genealogies. They dropped the "de" into their names. In the 1780s, the market for ennobling offices reached its highest prices in history, as wealthy commoners competed desperately for the ticket of social transformation. Robespierre was de Robespierre. Danton was de Danton. Brissot was de Warville. These were men who would later demolish the entire system, but in the decade before the revolution, they were still trying to join it. What this tells you is something crucial. The grievance that would fuel the revolution was not simply poverty, and not simply oppression. It was the specific, maddening experience of being talented and educated and successful and still being told, by a system that rewarded birth over merit, that you were not quite good enough. Arthur Young, the English observer whose relentless travels through France produced some of the sharpest pre-revolutionary commentary we have, captured it precisely. He saw a country that had developed an extraordinary civilization and failed to build a society capable of sustaining it. He saw productivity strangled by fragmented landholding and irrational taxation. He saw poverty so grinding that it had become, in the countryside, simply the ambient condition of life, not an emergency, just the weather. And he saw something else, a kingdom whose government was running out of money. The fiscal situation of the French crown in the 1780s was, by any modern standard, catastrophic. The wars of Louis XIV had left debts so large that the crown had simply stopped paying some of them, an effective bankruptcy in everything but name. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763 with France losing Canada, India, and most of its Atlantic empire to Britain, had added to the burden. Then came the American Revolutionary War, in which France backed the colonists against the British, partly from genuine ideological sympathy, partly from a desire for revenge. The strategy worked militarily. France helped America win its independence and humiliated Britain in the process. But the cost was staggering. Naval spending alone quadrupled in the years between 1776 and 1783. By the mid-1780s, roughly half of all French government expenditure was being consumed by debt service. Half. Not roads, not education, not the army, not the navy, just the interest payments on money already spent. New loans were taken out to pay the interest on old loans. Tax farmers, private businessmen who paid the crown in advance for the right to collect certain taxes and then kept the difference, extracted enormous sums from the population, while delivering far less to the treasury than a rational system would have produced. Meanwhile, the tax base itself was riddled with exemptions. The groups most capable of paying, the nobility and the clergy, paid the least. The people least capable of paying, the peasantry, bore the heaviest burden. Every attempt to reform this system ran into the wall of privilege. The parliaments, staffed by nobles who had bought their positions and would be personally damaged by tax reform, refused to register royal edicts that would have subjected them to the same levies as everyone else. The clergy mobilized its institutional power to protect its free gifts arrangement. The provincial estates of regions like Brittany and Languedoc dug in to protect their ancient exemptions. The crown was caught in a trap of its own long construction. It needed money. The only people with money were those with the political power to avoid paying taxes. And the political power to avoid paying taxes was itself a product of the privilege system the crown had used for centuries to reward its supporters. Louis XVI had inherited this trap, not built it. He was, in many ways, a decent man, hard-working, genuinely concerned about his subjects, uncomfortable with the extravagance of court life, interested in useful things like locksmith's craft and naval engineering. When told that peasants were starving, he believed it and was troubled by it. But he was also a man of almost paralyzing indecision, deeply uncomfortable with conflict, who dealt with political crisis by retreating into routine, by changing ministers when pressure became unbearable, and by ultimately refusing to commit to any reform that would have permanently alienated the elites whose support he needed. He was, in other words, a man of good intentions trapped in a system that required something beyond good intentions. It required either ruthless modernization from above, the kind of revolution from the top that his absolutist predecessors had sometimes attempted, or it required the system to break from below. It would break from below, but not yet. For now, the kingdom still stands. The bread is still, most of the time, available. The roads are still the finest in Europe. The cathedral at Reims still catches the morning light in a way that makes even skeptical observers feel something like reverence. The king has touched his 2,400 sick subjects and returned to Versailles. The reckoning is still 14 years away. Chapter 2. The man who could have saved everything. Here is the thing that haunts the entire story of the French Revolution. It didn't have to happen this way. Not the revolution itself. Something was going to break, eventually. The system was too strained, the inequalities too monstrous, the finances too ruined. Some kind of radical change was coming. But the particular form it took, the terror, the executions, the decade of war, the 100,000 dead, that wasn't inevitable. That was the result of choices, specific choices, made by specific people, in specific moments when other options existed. And the man who made the most consequential of those choices was not Robespierre, not Danton, not any of the revolutionaries. It was a shy, overweight, well-meaning king who couldn't make up his mind. Louis XVI was 20 years old when he became the most powerful man in Europe, and he knew, in that moment, that he was not equal to the task. He said so himself. He wept. He was reported to have said that he felt the world had collapsed upon him, and he was right, not about the world, but about himself. He was intelligent. He spoke multiple languages, kept detailed diaries, had a genuine interest in geography, science, and the practical arts. He was a skilled locksmith, of all things, which says something both charming and somewhat revealing about where his mind naturally went. He was devout, genuinely concerned about his subjects' welfare, and deeply uncomfortable with the extravagance he had inherited at Versailles. But he was also the wrong man for the wrong moment in the worst possible way. To understand Louis XVI's failure, you have to understand the trap he inherited. At the centre of that trap was the French crown's financial catastrophe, which had been building for a century and had reached a kind of terminal velocity by the time Louis took power in 1774. The math was brutal. The wars of Louis XIV, the Sun King, the supposed Golden Age, had left debt so enormous that the crown had periodically just stopped paying it, essentially declaring bankruptcy while maintaining the fiction of solvency. The 7 Years' War in the 1750s and 1760s had added to the pile. France lost Canada, most of its Indian territories, and its Atlantic Empire to Britain, and came out of it with nothing but debts and humiliation. Then came the American Revolutionary War, where France finally got its revenge on Britain, helping the colonists win their independence in what was, militarily, a genuine French triumph. But that triumph cost nearly 1 billion livres. And when it was over, half of every year's government revenue was going directly to pay interest on old loans. Not to roads, not to hospitals, not to the army, just to service the debt. And here was the trap's teeth. The people most capable of solving this problem, the nobility and the clergy, had the political power to avoid participating in the solution. Every time a reforming minister came along and said, "We need to tax the privileged classes," the parliaments, those regional high courts staffed entirely by nobles who had bought their positions, refused to register the new laws. Without registration, the laws had no force. And without the cooperation of the privileged classes, there was no way to fix the budget. France was trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open, and the people holding the drain open were the same people being asked to help fill the tub. Louis XVI understood this. His best ministers understood it. And for the 14 years between his coronation and the revolution, they tried, genuinely tried, to solve it. What followed was a masterclass in how good intentions and bad politics combined to produce catastrophe. The first serious attempt came from Turgot, an economist of the physiocratic school, a man of brilliant mind and catastrophic political instincts. He believed in free markets, rational administration, and the abolition of the medieval guild system that strangled French urban commerce. In 1776, he proposed 6 edicts that would have been genuinely transformative: abolishing the guilds, ending the corvée, the forced labour peasants owed their lords, and freeing the grain trade. The parliaments exploded, the privileged orders mobilised. Even the Queen, Marie Antoinette, who had her own reasons for opposing Turgot, worked against him. Within months, Louis dismissed him. The reforms were dead. Turgot's parting warning to the king has become one of history's most haunting prophecies. He told Louis that without fundamental fiscal reform, without breaking the power of the privileged classes over taxation, the first serious crisis would push France to the edge of ruin. Louis heard him. Louis thanked him. Louis did nothing. Necker came next. Jacques Necker, Swiss, Protestant, a banker by trade, was everything the French establishment was supposed to despise, and somehow could not resist. His wife ran one of the most brilliant salons in Paris, and she had spent years carefully constructing the image of her husband as a financial wizard, the only man who could save France. In 1776, when there was literally no one else willing to take the job, Louis appointed him. Necker's genius was for public relations more than economics. He refused to raise taxes, declaring that France's problem was management, not revenue, and instead financed the American war entirely through borrowing, at rates that made the bankers happy and made the public think everything was under control. His masterstroke was the Compte Rendu of 1781, the first ever public accounting of royal finances, a document that showed, implausibly, a surplus. What it carefully omitted was the cost of the war itself, which was classified as an extraordinary expense, and thus kept off the books. The public devoured it. Necker became a hero. The document was a work of creative accounting that would have been illegal under modern financial regulations, but it created a myth, the myth that France's finances were fine, that it only needed a competent manager, and that manager was Necker. When Necker eventually pushed for more political power and was dismissed by Louis in 1781, the public mourned him as if a saint had been exiled. The myth would return to haunt everyone, because when the real figures finally came out, the gap between what people believed about French finances and the reality would be staggering. After Necker came Calonne, charming, extravagant, deeply unprincipled, and unexpectedly visionary. He spent his first 3 years in office borrowing even more lavishly than his predecessors, doing nothing to address the structural problems, and hosting a magnificent show of royal confidence. And then, in August 1786, he walked into Louis XVI's study and placed before him the most radical reform proposal in the history of the French monarchy. The core of it was simple, even obvious. France needed a universal land tax, levied on all landowners regardless of rank or privilege, no exemptions for nobles, no exemptions for clergy. Just a straightforward tax on land, collected in kind at harvest time, administered by new provincial assemblies that would include representatives from all 3 orders. It would generate far more revenue than the patchwork of existing taxes, eliminate the most glaring inequities, and, this was the crucial gambit, bypass the parliaments by creating a new representative structure to manage it. It was, in its outlines, almost exactly what France needed. Louis, after months of deliberation, approved it. And Cologne, instead of going to the parliaments, where he knew he would be blocked, convened an assembly of notables, 144 hand-picked representatives of the elite who, he calculated, would be sufficiently honoured by their selection to rubber-stamp the royal programme. He was spectacularly wrong. The notables convened in February 1787, and from the first session, it was clear that Calonne had miscalculated everything. He had enemies everywhere in that room, parliamentaire judges who had despised him for years, clerics he had antagonised, courtiers who had been waiting for the chance to bring him down. The one man who had fully supported his plan, the foreign minister Vergennes, died 2 weeks before the assembly opened. The notables did not rubber stamp. They questioned. They demanded detailed accounts. They raised objections, some legitimate, some transparently self-interested. The clergy said they could not agree to anything without a meeting of the General Assembly of the Church. The judges said they could not pre-commit the parliaments. The nobles objected to a permanent, variable land tax being imposed on them without their consent. And underneath all the objections was a single consistent position: we cannot approve this. Only the Estates General, the representative body of the French nation, which had not met since 1614, has the authority to grant new taxes. Cologne, in desperation, tried to go over their heads. He published pamphlets. He appealed to public opinion. He implied, in a widely distributed document called the Avertissement, that the notables were simply protecting their selfish privileges at the expense of the common people. The move backfired completely. The public, which had been watching all of this with intense interest, decided that a minister who had presided over years of debt and extravagance now had the gall to lecture others about sacrifice. In April 1787, Cologne was dismissed. His replacement, the Archbishop of Toulouse-Loménie de Brienne, tried to push modified versions of the reforms through the parliaments directly. The parliaments refused. Brienne exiled the parlementaires. The parlementaires became instant heroes. Cities erupted in protest. In Grenoble, soldiers were pelted with roof tiles by angry crowds, an episode remembered as the Day of the Tiles. In Brittany, the local nobility organised unauthorised assemblies and sent delegations to Versailles, declaring the king's ministers criminals. They were arrested and thrown in the Bastille, creating martyrs. The clergy held a special convocation and, to the deep humiliation of Brienne, who was himself a bishop, voted to call for an immediate meeting of the Estates General. Brienne tried everything. He pushed through a fundamental restructuring of the judicial system, stripping the parliaments of most of their power, replacing them with more cooperative bodies. The response was immediate and furious. Every major provincial parliament ignored the reform and continued to meet. Lawyers went on strike. Provincial nobles organised unauthorised assemblies. Army officers refused to order their troops to fire on civilians. And then, in the summer of 1788, the weather broke. A catastrophic hailstorm swept across the Paris basin on July 13th, destroying crops across thousands of square miles at the worst possible moment, just before harvest. The winter that followed was the coldest in living memory. The Seine froze. The olive trees of Provence died. The grain that remained was scarce and expensive, and getting more so by the week. By the spring of 1789, bread prices in Paris would reach their highest point since the reign of Louis XIV. Workers in cities like Lyon, Rouen, and Nîmes were being laid off by the tens of thousands. Silk weavers in Lyon, 60,000 of them, had nothing to do, and the government, which should have been the backstop against all of this, was bankrupt. In August 1788, Brienne informed Louis XVI that the treasury was empty. Not depleted, empty. There was no money to pay the state's creditors. He suspended payments and issued government bonds in lieu of cash, effectively forcing the Crown's lenders to accept IOUs. The financial panic was immediate. Bond prices collapsed. Banks saw runs. The credit system that had kept France functional through decades of fiscal mismanagement finally seized up. Brienne resigned. The only man in France with enough public credibility to restore confidence was Necker, the same Necker whose creative accounting 8 years earlier had helped cause the crisis by convincing everyone that nothing was wrong. He was recalled in August 1788. His return was celebrated in Paris with bonfires and street celebrations, and he made clear from the beginning that he was just a caretaker. The real political question, the question of how France would be governed, who would pay what taxes, and on whose authority, could only be answered by the Estates General. Louis XVI had now arrived at the destination that every reforming minister had tried to avoid for 15 years, forced to summon a representative body whose powers and composition were undefined. In the middle of a financial collapse, in the middle of a food crisis, with a population that was angry, hungry, and politically activated in ways that hadn't been seen in generations, the Estates General would meet in May 1789. But before it even convened, the argument about who it would represent and in what proportions, had already become a revolution in itself. The parliaments, in a move that would have seemed politically clever just a few years earlier, and now looked catastrophically tone-deaf, declared that the Estates General should be organised exactly as it had been, in 1614. 3 separate chambers for clergy, nobility, and commoners, each with an equal vote, meaning the 2 privileged orders could always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The reaction was explosive. In coffee houses, in pamphlets, in the reading rooms and literary clubs that had become the infrastructure of French public opinion, the response was furious. Why should the 2 orders that paid the least taxes and owned the most land have veto power over the order that included almost everyone else in France? A pamphlet appeared in early 1789, written by a clergyman named Sieyès. Its opening lines were one of the most devastating questions in political history. What is the Third Estate? Everything. What has it been until now in the political order? Nothing. What does it demand? To become something. It sold in the hundreds of thousands. The political landscape of France was transforming faster than anyone, faster even than the most radical reformers could have imagined. The question was no longer whether change was coming. The question was whether it could be controlled. It could not. By the time the Estates General opened in May 1789, the country that Louis XVI had inherited 15 years earlier, that patchwork kingdom of privilege and poverty, of ancient tradition and modern frustration, was already gone. Something new was being born, and no one, not the king, not the ministers, not the revolutionary agitators waiting in the wings, had any idea what it would become. Chapter 3. The Summer the World Changed. By the time 1789 arrived, France had already been revolutionized in everything but name. The Estates General had been summoned, the king's finances had collapsed, the harvest had failed. The winter was the coldest anyone could remember. The Seine froze, the olive groves of Provence died, and in Paris, bread prices climbed toward their highest point in a century. And after months of pamphlets, petitions, and furious public debate, a question had settled itself at the centre of everything. Not just how to fix the budget, but who France actually belonged to. That question would be answered in the summer of 1789, in ways that would change the world forever. Here is what most people never fully appreciate. The French Revolution did not begin with the storming of the Bastille. It began 6 weeks earlier, in a tennis court, with an oath taken by men who had no weapons, no army, and no legal authority, and who changed everything anyway. The 5th of May, 1789, the Estates General opens at Versailles. The scene itself was a work of inadvertent symbolism. 1,200 delegates had gathered from across France, clergy, nobility, and Third Estate, dressed according to their orders. The clergy in purple and gold, the nobility in plumed hats and silk coats, the Third Estate in plain black. The procession through the streets of Versailles was magnificent, and if you knew what you were looking at, slightly absurd, a medieval pageant staged at the exact moment when the medieval world was ending. And from the very first day, the essential conflict was clear. The Third Estate delegates, lawyers, merchants, doctors, local officials, men of education and ambition from every corner of France, had been elected on the clear understanding that they would fight for 2 things. First, that their number of representatives would be doubled, giving them as many seats as the clergy and nobility combined. Louis had already conceded this. Second, and more consequentially, that votes would be counted by head rather than by order, meaning each individual delegate would have 1 vote, rather than each order having 1 collective vote. This second demand was the revolution before the revolution, because if votes were counted by order, the clergy and nobility together would always outvote the Third Estate 2-1. But if votes were counted by head, and if even a handful of liberal nobles and lower clergy voted with the Third Estate, the commoners could actually govern. They could transform a medieval advisory body into something genuinely new, a national legislature. The privileged orders refused. For 6 weeks, nothing happened. The 3 estates met separately, argued procedurally, and refused to budge. The Third Estate delegates sat in their hall and waited, not for the king, not for the nobility, but for some change in the political weather that would allow them to act. The change came on June 13th, when 3 parish priests, ordinary country clergy, who had nothing in common with the bishops who dominated the First Estate, walked across the hall and joined the Third Estate sessions. 3 men, but their symbolism was enormous. They proved that the wall between the orders was not absolute. They proved that the revolution the Third Estate wanted, a revolution based on merit and equality rather than birth and privilege, had allies where no one expected them. Within a week, more clergy followed, and on June 17th, with this small coalition of commons and clergy sitting together, the Third Estate did something extraordinary. They voted to rename themselves. They were no longer the Third Estate, a subordinate order waiting for permission to speak. They were the National Assembly, the representatives of the French people, constituted by right and by necessity, with or without the king's approval. It was, in its quiet way, the most revolutionary act of the entire revolution. Not an execution, not a battle, just a vote on a name. Louis XVI's response was predictable. He locked them out. On June 20th, the delegates arrived at their meeting hall to find it closed, officially for renovations, but everyone understood the message. For a moment, the delegation stood in the street outside Versailles in the June heat, uncertain what to do. Then someone suggested the nearby indoor tennis court. They walked to it, they filed inside, and in that bare, echoing room, they did something that no group of representatives in French history had ever done. They took an oath. Standing together, clergy, nobles who had joined them, and the commoners who had brought them here, they swore collectively that they would not disperse until France had a constitution. Not until the king gave his approval, not until the privileged orders came around, until France had a constitution. The tennis court oath is one of those moments in history that sounds simple in retrospect and was, in its actual moment, almost incomprehensibly audacious. These were not soldiers. They had no weapons. And they had no legal basis for their existence beyond the argument, which many of them had recently read in C.S.'s pamphlet, that the Third Estate was the nation, and the nation had the right to constitute itself. Louis could have arrested them. He may have considered it. In the end, he backed down. On June 27th, he ordered the remaining clergy and noble holdouts to join the National Assembly. The battle of the 3 orders was over. But even as it ended, a new crisis was beginning. And this one would be settled not in a tennis court, but in the streets. Paris in July 1789 was a city on the edge of explosion. The bread price had been climbing since winter. By mid-July, workers were spending up to 90% of their wages on bread alone, leaving nothing for rent, clothing, firewood, or anything else. Unemployment was rampant. The textile industry was in collapse, partly because of the trade agreement with Britain that had flooded the French market with cheaper English goods. The previous year's harvest had been catastrophic. The winter had been brutal. And now it was summer, and the heat was pressing down on a city full of hungry, exhausted, frightened people who had spent months reading pamphlets telling them that their misery was the fault of the privileged, the speculators, the hoarding nobles, and the king's ministers. Rumours ran through Paris like fever. Troops were gathering outside the city. True enough, Louis had been quietly moving military units toward Paris since late June, nervous about disorder. The Queen and her circle were plotting to dissolve the National Assembly, also plausible, given the Queen's known hostility to reform. The King was going to dismiss Necker, the popular finance minister, the man the public believed had saved France, and install a hardliner who would crack down on everything. On July 11th, the rumour became reality. Louis dismissed Necker and replaced him with a minister known to be hostile to reform. Paris erupted. On July 12th, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins stood on a table in the gardens of the Palais Royal, a fashionable arcade that had become the de facto headquarters of Parisian radical opinion, and shouted to the crowd around him. Necker was dismissed. The king was preparing to massacre the patriots. Citizens of Paris had to arm themselves. He grabbed a green leaf from a nearby tree and pinned it to his lapel as a cockade, a symbol of resistance. Within hours, green cockades were everywhere. Within a day, the tricolour, blue, white, and red, had replaced them as the emblem of the revolution that was now visibly underway. Crowds surged through Paris, shutting customs posts, attacking symbols of authority, demanding bread. The king's cavalry was deployed, but refused to charge into civilian crowds. The French Guards, the main garrison force in Paris, began fraternizing with protesters rather than dispersing them. On July 13th, the citizens of Paris did something they had done in cities across France in recent weeks. They formed their own government. The electors who had chosen the Paris delegation to the Estates General declared themselves a permanent municipal council. They authorised the formation of a citizen militia, what would become the National Guard, to maintain order under their direction rather than the Crown's. Paris was no longer governed by the King's representatives. It was governing itself, and on July 14th, it went to war. The Bastille was not a symbol of freedom crushed. It was, by 1789, a nearly obsolete fortress that held exactly 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and a nobleman locked up at his family's request. As a practical matter, it was nearly irrelevant. But it had cannons, and it had gunpowder, and the citizen militia of Paris, which had been forming itself over the previous 24 hours, needed both. A crowd of several hundred, mostly artisans, workers, and small tradespeople from the surrounding neighbourhoods, along with a contingent of mutinous French guards, marched to the Bastille that morning and demanded its surrender. The governor, the Marquis de Launay, stalled. Negotiations went nowhere. The crowd grew larger and more restless. Then someone, historians are still not certain who, fired a shot. Within hours it was over. The crowd stormed the outer courtyard. De Launay, seeing that his garrison of about 80 men could not hold against several thousand, surrendered. He was led out into the crowd, which tore him to pieces and paraded his head on a pike through the streets of Paris. The Bastille fell. When news reached Versailles, a courtier woke the king. "Is this a revolt?" Louis XVI is said to have asked. "No, sire," came the reply. "It is a revolution." What happened next revealed something crucial about Louis XVI, and about why the revolution would unfuck itself from the possibility of peaceful reform. He capitulated. He recalled Necker. He appeared before the National Assembly and announced that the troops around Paris would be withdrawn. He travelled to Paris and accepted the tricolour cockade from the mayor, presenting himself awkwardly, visibly uncomfortable, as a king who embraced the revolution. The crowd cheered him. For a moment it seemed as if something extraordinary might actually work. A revolution absorbed, a monarchy transformed, a constitutional settlement reached without blood. But the concession had come too late, and it revealed too much. What Paris had learnt on July 14th was that the king would back down when threatened by force. What the rest of France was about to learn was the same lesson. News travelled slowly in 1789, but it travelled. And as word spread from Paris to the provinces, garbled, amplified, distorted, something extraordinary and terrifying began to happen across the French countryside. The peasants, who had spent the spring and early summer drafting their cahiers de doléances, those remarkable documents listing their grievances, their hopes, their demands, had been waiting. They had been told that the Estates General would fix everything. They had heard rumours that the king had surrendered to the people. They had concluded, reasonably enough, that the old order was done, which meant the old obligations, the feudal dues, the seigneurial dues, the tithes, the various fees and obligations that flowed upward from peasant to lord to church, were done with it. And then a different rumour started. Brigands were coming. Armed men, hired by the nobles, were sweeping through the countryside to destroy the harvest before the peasants could bring it in. A last act of revenge by a dying aristocracy. It wasn't true. But it felt true, in the way that things feel true when you are hungry and frightened and have spent months reading pamphlets about the aristocracy's wickedness. Across most of France, in the last week of July, peasants armed themselves, formed militia companies, and prepared to defend their villages. And as armed, frightened men moved through the countryside, they looked, from a distance, exactly like the brigands everyone feared. Panic fed panic. The Great Fear, as historians would call it, swept France like a wildfire, but the panic transformed into something else. Action. Peasant communities attacked the chateau of their lords, not randomly, but with specific targets. They went after the rooms where the feudal records were kept. They burned the documents, the contracts, the registers, the centuries of paper that documented what they owed, to whom, and on what terms. With the documents burned, the debts, in a practical sense, ceased to exist. In some regions, Normandy, Burgundy, Alsace, Dauphiné, the attacks went further. Manors were burned. Lords were forced at sword point to sign away their rights. In one particularly dramatic incident in Franche-Comté, a chateau was destroyed by an explosion that killed several of the attackers, and rather than being condemned, the event was absorbed into the spreading narrative of justified vengeance. The National Assembly, watching all of this from Versailles, with a mixture of exhilaration and terror, realised it had to act. On the night of August 4th, they did, in a session that became one of the most extraordinary in parliamentary history. It began as a calculated manoeuvre. A liberal nobleman, the Viscount de Noailles, was prompted by allies to propose the abolition of feudal dues as a way of calming the countryside. But the moment the proposal was made, something unexpected happened. It caught fire. Noble after noble stood up and renounced his privileges. Then clerics renounced theirs. Then cities renounced their special exemptions, their ancient trading monopolies, their carefully accumulated privileges. Regional tax exemptions fell. Purchased offices fell. Serfdom fell. The hunting rights of nobles fell. Church tithes fell. By 2 a.m, in a hall lit by candles, deputies weeping with emotion and shouting with revolutionary enthusiasm, more than 1,000 years of accumulated privilege had been, in principle, in the intoxication of that extraordinary night, abolished. What a nation! What a moment! Wrote one deputy afterward. Another called it the night of love. The sobriety would come later, when lawyers started drafting the actual legislation. Much of what was renounced that night would be clawed back, modified, made conditional. Feudal dues could still be redeemed by cash payment, rather than simply abolished. The details would be contested for years, but the principle had been declared. And then, 3 weeks later, it was given its enduring philosophical foundation. On the 26th of August 1789, the National Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. 17 articles, a document you can read in 10 minutes and spend a lifetime contemplating. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Article 1. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. Article 3. The aim of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. Article 2. What the Declaration did, quietly, in the cadence of legal prose, was declare the entire old order illegitimate. Not gradually, not with exceptions. The idea that birth could confer political power, that rank could exempt from obligation, that kings ruled by divine right rather than popular consent, all of it was, in the language of the Declaration, simply incompatible with the rights of man. It was not the first such document in history. The American Declaration of Independence, 13 years earlier, had made similar claims. Thomas Jefferson, who had been in Paris as the American ambassador and witnessed the early months of the Revolution with barely contained excitement, had been consulted by some of the Assembly's more liberal members. The influence showed, but the French Declaration was different from the American one in a crucial way. The American Declaration was, in the end, a document of independence. It explained why the colonies were leaving the British Empire. The French Declaration was a document of transformation. It explained what France would become. It was addressed not just to France, but to humanity. That universalist ambition would be the revolution's greatest legacy and its most dangerous quality. A revolution that declares itself on behalf of all mankind is a revolution with no natural borders and no natural stopping point. But before any of this could solidify into permanent change, there was one more act in the drama of 1789, and it was performed, in its opening movement, not by male lawyers and philosophically inclined nobles, but by the women of Paris. October 5th. Bread was still scarce, the price was still high, and rumours had reached Paris that at a banquet at Versailles, officers of the royal bodyguard had trampled the tricolour cockade underfoot, a gesture of contempt for the revolution that, in the supercharged atmosphere of revolutionary Paris, was both unwise and unforgivable. In the early morning, women began gathering at market stalls, at the Hôtel de Ville, at street corners across the eastern neighbourhoods of Paris. They talked about bread. They talked about the cockade. They talked about the king, sitting 12 miles away at Versailles with his family and his guards and his granaries, while Paris went hungry. And then they marched. 7,000 of them, some with pikes, some with weapons taken from the Hôtel de Ville, dragging cannon through the October rain toward Versailles. They arrived in the evening, flooded into the National Assembly, demanded bread, and demanded that the king come to Paris. Lafayette and 20,000 National Guardsmen followed hours later. The next morning, a small group of protesters broke into the palace, killed 2 royal guards, and nearly reached Marie Antoinette's apartments before being turned back. Lafayette appeared on the palace balcony with the king and queen, offering a gesture of loyalty that was meant to calm the crowds, but that also visually equated the monarchy with the new popular order. By that afternoon, it was settled. The king would go to Paris. Louis XVI, his family, and his court made the 12-mile journey in a procession that took 9 hours, surrounded by tens of thousands of people. When they arrived, he was installed in the Tuileries Palace, a royal residence in central Paris, far from the protected distance of Versailles, within sight and hearing of the city that had just made him its captive. The king was in Paris. The assembly would soon follow. The revolution had, in 6 months, transformed the political landscape of France beyond recognition. The absolute monarchy was over. The Declaration had proclaimed new principles. The night of August 4th had torn down the old social order. Paris had demonstrated, twice, that armed popular pressure could move the king when nothing else could. What remained to be built, a new constitutional order, a new relationship between crown and nation, a new France, would take 3 more years, and it would not survive. But in the summer of 1789, in that extraordinary season when everything seemed possible, almost no one could have predicted that. They had done the impossible. They had brought down a system that had stood for 1,000 years. What could possibly stop them now? Chapter 4. The Impossible Dream of the Constitutional Monarchy. By the autumn of 1789, France had accomplished something that would have seemed impossible just 12 months before. The absolute monarchy was over. The Bastille had fallen. The Declaration of the Rights of Man had proclaimed new principles for a new world. The king himself had been brought to Paris, where he now lived in the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by a city that was simultaneously his capital and his cage. And now, everyone agreed, the real work could begin. Build a constitution, create a new France, turn the revolutionary energy of that extraordinary summer into stable, lasting institutions. Preserve what had been won without losing it in the fire of further radicalism. It seemed achievable. For a brief, luminous moment, it seemed not just achievable but inevitable. It was not. The men who had declared themselves the National Constituent Assembly in the summer of 1789 spent the next 2 years redesigning France from the ground up. And in many respects, what they accomplished was extraordinary. They abolished the old administrative chaos, the patchwork of provinces, generalities, and competing jurisdictions that had made France simultaneously ungovernable and unjust, and replaced it with 83 new departments, roughly equal in size and population, each governed by elected assemblies. They abolished the entire system of purchased offices. They replaced the Byzantine tangle of different tax systems with 3 uniform direct taxes, levied without exceptions. They swept away the guild system, the old seigneurial courts, the welter of conflicting local customs that had made French law a hall of mirrors. They created elected judges, elected administrators, elected everything. On paper, it was a revolution of rationalization. France remade, according to the principles of the Enlightenment, the messy historical accumulations of centuries replaced by clean, symmetrical, logical structures. In practice, it was also a massive experiment with no manual, conducted under enormous pressure by people who disagreed with each other about almost everything, in a country that was simultaneously facing financial collapse and chronic food shortages. The new tax system, for instance, was theoretically beautiful. Direct taxes, no exemptions, everyone pays their fair share. The problem was that the Assembly abolished the mechanism for enforcing it, the old tax farmers and revenue officers, without building a replacement. They trusted that citizens, liberated by the revolution and educated in their new civic duties, would simply pay. Many did not. Tax revenues collapsed. The financial crisis that had caused the revolution in the first place grew worse. The solution they reached for was radical and double-edged. They nationalized the church's property. In November 1789, the Assembly voted to put all church lands at the disposition of the nation. To monetize these vast holdings and avoid a ruinous fire sale of property, They created a new financial instrument, assignats, paper notes backed by the value of the nationalized church lands. In theory, as the lands were sold, the assignats would be retired. In practice, the government kept printing them. By 1793, the assignat had lost 2/3 of its face value. Inflation became a constant companion of the revolution, squeezing the urban poor who had made the revolution possible, and ultimately contributing to the very instability the assembly was trying to prevent. But the deeper problem with the church's nationalization was not financial, it was political, and it would prove catastrophic. If the storming of the Bastille was the revolution's most dramatic moment, and the night of August 4th its most idealistic, then the civil constitution of the clergy was its most consequential mistake. The logic was understandable. If the church's property belonged to the nation, then the church's clergy were, in a sense, public servants. And public servants in the new France were elected by their fellow citizens. So bishops and parish priests would now be elected by eligible voters, which included Protestants, Jews, and men with no religious affiliation at all. More explosively, the new bishops would not be confirmed by the Pope. Rome would merely be notified of their appointment. The Pope remained silent for months. French clergy waited anxiously for guidance. The Assembly, impatient, demanded that all clergy take a public oath of loyalty to the nation, the law, and the constitutional arrangement, effectively forcing every priest in France to publicly declare whether he accepted the new order. The results shattered France along lines that had nothing to do with social class or political philosophy. In Paris and its surroundings, the majority of clergy took the oath. In Alsace, less than a quarter did. In western France, Brittany, the Vendée, Anjou, the refusal rate was overwhelming. Roughly half the parish priests in France as a whole refused. When the Pope finally spoke, in the spring of 1791, he condemned the civil constitution entirely. Many priests who had taken the oath promptly retracted it. Now France had two parallel Catholic churches: the Constitutional Church, staffed by priests who had sworn allegiance to the revolution, and the Refractory Church, staffed by those who had refused. In village after village, the question of which priest said which Mass and which your neighbours attended became a declaration of your political identity. The revolution had drawn a line through every community in France, and the line passed directly through the altar. For Louis XVI, a man of genuine personal piety who had agonized over signing the civil constitution, this was the moment of inner rupture. He signed it in public. He despaired of it in private. His confessor refused the oath. His aunts, devout and influential, left France rather than worship at a schismatic altar. The king began to feel what he would later articulate openly, that he was not a free man, that he had been coerced into betraying his faith, and that the revolution he had accepted was not the revolution he could live with. He began to plan his escape. On the night of the 20th of June, 1791, Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, their two children, and a small party of attendants slipped out of the Tuileries Palace in disguise and climbed into a large coach waiting in a quiet street. They were headed northeast, toward the frontier, toward the waiting armies of Austria, toward what the king hoped would be safety and what the queen hoped would be armed rescue. It was the most consequential gamble of Louis's reign, and it failed in the most humiliating possible way. The coach was too slow. It was large enough to carry the royal family comfortably, but not fast enough to outrun suspicion. Military escorts arranged by the royalist General Bouillet arrived at rendezvous points and, finding the coach, delayed, withdrew, assuming the plan had been abandoned. Word spread along the route that something unusual was moving through the night. At the small town of Varennes, the local postmaster recognized the king's face. It appeared on the currency and raised the alarm. The town mobilized. The National Guard blocked the road. Ha! Deputies sent galloping from Paris arrived with orders to bring the royal family back. Louis XVI, King of France, was escorted back to Paris under guard, accompanied for most of the journey by vast crowds who watched in silence. The silence was not reverence. It was something colder and more frightening. The suspension of judgment while people decided what they thought. What they thought, when they thought it through, was devastating. The king had fled. The king had left behind a written declaration denouncing the revolution, its principles, its institutions, its treatment of the church. He had essentially announced that his acceptance of the constitution had been a performance, a forced capitulation, rather than a genuine commitment. What constitutional monarchy could be built on a king who had tried to flee? The National Assembly's answer to that question was one of the most remarkable acts of collective self-deception in political history. They decided to pretend it hadn't happened. Or rather, they invented a fiction. The king, they declared, had not fled. He had been abducted. The declaration he left behind, denouncing the revolution, forced on him by treacherous advisors. His evident desire to reach the Austrian border, a misunderstanding. The general who had arranged the military escorts, him. It was all his fault. This fiction was so transparent that almost no one believed it. But almost everyone, at that particular moment, needed to believe it, or at least to act as if they did. The constitution was nearly finished. The revolution was nearly institutionalized. A republic, most of the Assembly's members feared, would mean the permanent entry of the Paris crowds into politics. Unpredictable, ungovernable, terrifying. So they told the lie. Louis XVI was reinstated, temporarily suspended while the fiction was being constructed, then handed back a crown he had tried to throw away. On the 14th of September 1791, in an atmosphere of careful, choreographed celebration, the king accepted the constitution. The assembly dissolved itself. The Legislative Assembly, fresh deputies, no holdovers from the constituent, would take up the work of governing France under the new system. The British ambassador, watching all of this with the detached clarity that only comes from not being French, filed a report in April of that year that proved entirely accurate. The present constitution is unpopular and cannot last. It lasted exactly 1 year. The constitutional monarchy collapsed not from internal contradiction alone, though it had plenty of those, but from a decision that was both understandable and catastrophic, the decision to go to war. By the winter of 1791 to 1792, the pressure for war had become almost irresistible, for reasons that cut across normal political divisions. The king wanted war, secretly, because he calculated that a French military defeat would restore his power with foreign assistance. The Girondins, the moderate Republican faction rising to dominance in the Legislative Assembly, wanted war because they believed a victorious war would consolidate the revolution and expose the king's treachery. The émigrés, the nobility who had fled France and were organising counter-revolutionary forces in the German Rhineland, were already conducting what amounted to a slow-motion military provocation. The Holy Roman Emperor and the King of Prussia had issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, warning that the situation in France is of common interest to all the sovereigns of Europe, which everyone read as a threat. Only a handful of voices counselled against war. Among them, most presciently, was a small and not particularly influential member of the Jacobin Club, from the provincial city of Arras, Maximilien Robespierre. He argued, with remorseless logic, that a country whose army had been devastated by officer emigration, whose finances were in chaos, whose government was paralysed by distrust between legislature and king, should not invite military confrontation with the professional armies of Austria and Prussia. He was voted down. On the 20th of April, 1792, France declared war on Austria. For 3 months, it was a catastrophe. The French army, demoralised and leaderless, suffered defeat after defeat. Fortresses fell, regiments mutinied, the road to Paris seemed open. At the front, the commander of the Allied Austro-Prussian forces issued the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening Paris with military execution and total destruction if the royal family was harmed, a threat so counterproductive that it united Parisians across all political divisions in outrage. The war changed everything. It accelerated the radicalization of Paris. It transformed suspicion of the king from a theoretical concern into an urgent emergency. Every military defeat was attributed to treason, and the likeliest traitor, everyone agreed, was the king himself, who corresponded with foreign powers, who had tried to flee, whose queen was the sister of the Austrian emperor. On the 10th of August 1792, the constitutional monarchy died. A crowd of several thousand, Parisians from the working neighbourhoods, reinforced by radical National Guardsmen and volunteers from the provinces, marched on the Tuileries. The palace's Swiss Guard fired into them. The crowd tore through the defences. The king, who had already sought refuge with the Legislative Assembly, watched from a box as the palace that had been his cage was stormed and his guards were massacred. The Assembly suspended the king, convened an emergency national convention to rewrite the constitution, and ordered the royal family imprisoned in the Temple, a medieval fortress in central Paris that would be their home for the next months. The constitutional monarchy was over. The Republic was beginning. And in the darkness of Paris, in the late summer of 1792, in an atmosphere poisoned by military terror, political extremism, and rumours of aristocratic conspiracy, the revolution was about to show what it looked like when it lost all restraint. Looking back at the constitutional period with the advantage of hindsight, it is tempting to conclude that it was doomed from the beginning, that a man who tried to flee could never have been a constitutional monarch, that a revolution that had demolished so much could not have stopped itself at a halfway point. But that judgment is too easy. The constitutional monarchy failed for specific reasons at specific moments, and many of those moments could have gone differently. If Louis XVI had genuinely embraced the new order, not performed acceptance while plotting escape, but actually committed himself to constitutional rule, he might have made it work. Plenty of his contemporaries were doing exactly that. The great liberal nobles, the constitutional bishops like Talleyrand, the moderates who genuinely believed in the settlement they were building. If the civil constitution of the clergy had been handled differently, with more patience, more consultation, more sensitivity to the fact that you cannot restructure a religion by legislative decree, the religious schism that fractured French society might have been avoided or at least mitigated. If the decision for war had been delayed even by 6 months, long enough for the army to stabilise, long enough for the constitution to put down roots, everything that followed might have been different. But none of these things happened, and in the space where they didn't happen, the revolution radicalised. The men who had dreamed of a constitutional monarchy gave way to men who dreamed of a republic, and the men who dreamed of a republic would, in their turn, give way to men who dreamed of something far darker. The summer of 1789 had been a season of hope. The autumn of 1792 would be a season of blood. Chapter 5. When the revolution ate its own. There is a number you should keep in your mind as you listen to this chapter. 17,000. That is the minimum estimate of the number of people formally executed during the period known as the Terror, the 12 months between the autumn of 1793 and the summer of 1794. 17,000 death sentences pronounced by revolutionary tribunals, sent for execution by guillotine, drowning, firing squad, or worse. And that number doesn't count the tens of thousands more who died in prison or were killed in the internal wars the revolution had generated in Western France, or starved to death as the economic chaos deepened. 1 year, 17,000. Here is the more disturbing number. At the beginning of 1793, the people ordering and carrying out these executions were the same people who had proclaimed, in 1789, that all men are born free and equal in rights, that liberty is the natural and imprescriptible right of every human being, and that the purpose of all political association is the preservation of these rights. They were not hypocrites in the ordinary sense. They believed what they were doing was necessary. That is the most frightening thing about the Terror, not that it was carried out by monsters, but that it was carried out by true believers. The French First Republic was proclaimed on the 21st of September 1792, the day the National Convention first met, the same day that French forces stopped the Prussian army at the Battle of Valmy. It was a day of genuine triumph, one of those rare historical moments when the possible and the impossible seem briefly indistinguishable. But the Republic was born in a context of emergency that would never fully lift for the next decade. France was at war with Austria and Prussia simultaneously. The king was imprisoned. The economy was in freefall. The assignats, the paper currency backed by nationalised church property, had already lost nearly half their value, and Paris was in the grip of a political fever that had, just weeks earlier, produced the September massacres. The September massacres. They deserve their own moment of attention, because they tell you something essential about what happens to revolutions when fear metastasizes into paranoia. In the first days of September 1792, with the Prussian army advancing and the road to Paris apparently open, crowds broke into the city's prisons, filled with political prisoners, common criminals, refractory priests, and anyone who had attracted the suspicion of revolutionary committees, and began killing. For 5 days, improvised people's tribunals conducted summary trials. Some of the accused were acquitted, released to cheers from the watching crowd. Most were condemned on the spot and killed on the street. Between 1,100 and 1,400 people died. The majority were not dangerous political enemies. They were ordinary prisoners, forgers, petty criminals, priests whose only offence was refusing an oath. The convention pretended it hadn't happened. The Girondins and the Jacobins blamed each other. Nobody was punished. The phrase "September massacres" became a political insult, hurled back and forth for the next year. And the memory of those 5 days, the knowledge that revolutionary Paris was capable of organised mob slaughter, settled into the political atmosphere like a permanent low-grade toxin. Then, on the 21st of January 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined in what is now the Place de la Concorde. The king died with composure. He tried to address the crowd. He was drowned out by drums. His head was held up to the crowd. The severed head of the most Christian king of France, descendant of St. Louis, the anointed sovereign of 27 million people. It was not a moment of triumph. It was a moment of no return. The execution of the king transformed France's international situation overnight, and not for the better. Within 6 weeks, Britain, Holland, Spain, and most of the other major European powers had joined the coalition against France. By the spring of 1793, the Republic was fighting virtually everyone simultaneously and losing. The military situation in early 1793 was catastrophic. The Austrian army re-entered Belgium. The Prussians pushed back in the east. In the Vendée, that isolated, landlocked region of western France, whose people had never reconciled themselves to the civil constitution of the clergy, the execution of the king, or the revolution's forced conscription, open insurrection broke out. Peasant armies, organised around local nobles and refractory priests, defeated Republican forces in battle after battle. By summer, the Vendée was effectively under royalist control. Meanwhile, in dozens of provincial cities, a different kind of revolt was brewing, not royalist, but anti-Paris. Moderate Republicans, frightened by the radicalism of the Jacobins and the growing dominance of Paris over the nation's politics, rose in what became known as the Federalist Revolt. Lyon, Bordeaux, Marseille, Caen, one by one, major cities declared their independence from the convention and its Paris-dominated committees. France, in the summer of 1793, was simultaneously fighting foreign armies on its eastern and northern frontiers, a royalist civil war in the west, and republican rebellions in its great provincial cities. The treasury was empty. Bread prices had returned to their revolutionary-era heights. And in Paris, the radical sans-culottes, the working men and women of the city's eastern neighbourhoods who had been the revolution's street army since 1789, were demanding price controls, the execution of traitors and hoarders, and increasingly radical economic measures. It was in this context, genuine emergency, genuine fear, genuine military crisis, that the apparatus of the terror was constructed. And it was constructed with remarkable speed and remarkable efficiency. The Committee of Public Safety was the engine. Created in April 1793 as an emergency executive, it acquired its defining character in July, when Maximilien Robespierre joined it. By summer, 12 men sitting in the old throne room at the Tuileries were effectively governing France, directing the armies, managing the economy, overseeing the courts, and deciding who lived and who died. The Revolutionary Tribunal, established in March 1793, processed the condemned. In its early months it worked slowly and acquitted many of the accused. By the autumn, as the law of suspects broadened the definition of enemy of the Republic to include almost anyone who had expressed doubt about the revolution's direction, the tribunal's rhythm accelerated. By the spring of 1794, it was sending people to the guillotine so fast that defenders were given less time than it took to read the charges. The guillotine itself, that strange rational device, designed by a physician who thought that death should be instantaneous and equal, available to all regardless of social rank, became the symbol of the age. In Paris, it stood in the great public squares, its blade rising and falling in public view. The crowds watched. Sometimes they cheered, sometimes they were silent. Who were the men who ran this machine? They were not, in the main, aristocrats or reactionaries turned radical. They were almost entirely the educated middle class, lawyers, doctors, journalists, minor officials, the very people the revolution had been made by and for. Robespierre is the central figure and the most psychologically baffling. He was a lawyer from Arras, neat and precise in his dress, obsessive about personal hygiene, deeply read in Rousseau, utterly incorruptible. Nobody ever bribed Robespierre. Nobody ever caught him in an inconsistency. Nobody ever found a gap between his public and private persona. His nickname was the Incorruptible. He meant it as a compliment to himself, and it was. He genuinely believed in the things he said. He believed in the sovereignty of the people. He believed in virtue, that peculiar Rousseauian concept of civic virtue that demanded the subordination of every private interest to the public good. He believed that France could be remade into something approaching a republic of virtue, if only the enemies of virtue, the corrupt, the aristocratic, the self-interested, the cowardly, could be removed from the body politic. It was this logic, rigorous, internally consistent, and completely terrifying, that drove the terror forward. If virtue was the principle of the Republic, then the Republic's survival depended on virtue. And since every setback, every military defeat, every economic crisis was evidence that someone somewhere was betraying the Republic, then the Republic could only be saved by finding and eliminating the traitors. The logic required suspects. The suspects required a tribunal. The tribunal required a guillotine. His colleagues on the committee were different in temperament, but similar in function. Saint Just, barely 25 years old, beautiful, cold as marble, utterly without mercy, was the revolution's philosopher of violence. It was Saint Just who articulated the doctrine most nakedly. The Republic consists in the extermination of everything that opposes it. Carnot was the organizer, the military genius who raised and directed the armies that eventually turned the tide. Billaud-Varenne and Collot d'Herbois were the zealots who went to the provinces to enforce revolutionary discipline and came back having presided over massacres. Georges-Jacques Danton was the revolution's great pragmatist, its most human voice, a man of enormous physical presence, loud laughter, and genuine political intelligence, who understood that the terror was making enemies faster than it was destroying them, and who eventually began calling for mercy. That call would cost him his life. Jean-Paul Marat was something different again, the revolution's prophet of paranoia, a physician-turned-journalist whose newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people, had spent 4 years insisting that betrayal was everywhere, that only more executions could save the Republic. He was murdered in his bath in July 1793 by Charlotte Corday, a Girondin sympathizer who believed that killing one man might save 100,000. Marat became a revolutionary martyr instead, his murder transformed by the painter David into one of the most iconic images in all of Western art. The terror did not fall equally. In Paris, it was concentrated at the top: great nobles, former ministers, members of the old Constituent Assembly, Girondin deputies, and eventually anyone who had been too successful or too visible, or who had made the wrong enemies on the Committee of Public Safety. In the provinces, it was more chaotic and more brutal. Lyon had revolted against the convention in the summer of 1793. When Republican forces retook the city in October, the reprisals were savage. The representative on mission, one of those deputies sent from Paris to enforce revolutionary discipline, ordered the city's name changed to Liberated City, because it was no longer worthy of the name of Lyon, and began systematically destroying its finest architecture. Mass executions by cannon fire were organised when the guillotine proved too slow. In the Vendée, the war reached a level of violence that defied any normal calculus. The Republican armies, frustrated by the mobile guerrilla tactics of the royalist peasant forces, eventually adopted the strategy of comprehensive devastation, burning villages, destroying crops, killing civilian populations indiscriminately. By some estimates, the Vendée lost a quarter of its population. It was, historians have debated, a genocide, or something very close to one, committed by a Republican government in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. In Nantes, the representative Jean-Baptiste Carrier organised Republican baptisms, the drowning of prisoners in the Loire, tied together on barges, which were then sunk. Priests and nuns were among those drowned. Carrier later claimed he had been preventing an epidemic. Historians estimate he killed at least 2,000 people. These were not acts of passion. They were organized, they were ordered, they were reported back to Paris. The Committee of Public Safety knew what was happening. They approved. The mechanism of the terror had its own terrible internal dynamic. Once you accepted that the survival of the Republic depended on eliminating its enemies, and that enemies could be identified by their insufficient commitment to the Republic, then the definition of enemy could only expand. First the aristocrats, then the Girondins, then the indulgents, those who said the terror was going too far, that some mercy was possible. Danton was an indulgent. Danton was arrested in March 1794, tried by the revolutionary tribunal he had helped create, and guillotined. "Danton, you will be next," he reportedly told Robespierre before his arrest. The prophecy was accurate, even if the timing was off. Then came the ultra-radicals, the Hébertists, who thought the terror wasn't radical enough, who organised the movement to de-Christianise France entirely, replacing the Christian calendar with a revolutionary one, turning churches into temples of reason, melting down sacred vessels for the Republic's war chests. Heir and his allies were arrested and guillotined in March 1794, 3 weeks before Danton. By the spring of 1794, Robespierre and the rump of the Committee of Public Safety were essentially alone. They had eliminated the right. They had eliminated the moderate left. They had eliminated the radical left. What remained was a government with no constituency but virtue, and virtue, as it turns out, is not a sufficient basis for political survival. The law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, removed the last procedural protections from the accused. Defence lawyers were abolished. The accused could not call witnesses. The only verdicts available were acquittal, which became vanishingly rare, or death. In the 6 weeks that followed, the guillotine worked faster than at any previous point in the terror. Historians call this period the Great Terror. Robespierre and Saint-Just seemed to be preparing for a final purge that would eliminate everyone who remained. In the prisons of Paris, representatives and former colleagues of the committee lived in daily terror of hearing their own names read out. They had a choice: act first or die waiting. On 9 Thermidor Year 2 of the revolutionary calendar, the 27th of July, 1794, the convention turned on Robespierre. It happened with shocking speed. Representatives who had spent months voting for everything the committee demanded suddenly found their voices. When Robespierre rose to speak, as he had done hundreds of times, in that precise, measured voice, he was shouted down. It had never happened before. He tried to speak again. More shouting. He turned to appeal to different sections of the hall. Nobody answered. Saint-Just, who had never been shouted down in his life, stood rigid as the room disintegrated around him. Billaud Varennes, who had spent years ordering executions, attacked his former colleagues with frantic energy. Robespierre was arrested. His jaw was shattered. It is still debated whether by a self-inflicted gunshot wound or by a gendarme's pistol. The next day, July 28, he was guillotined, his jaw bound up with a cloth bandage, his face a mask of agony. In the same square where he had sent so many others before him, 21 of his allies were executed on the same day. Saint-Just died with the same cold composure he had shown in life, reportedly gesturing to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and saying, in effect, "I did this." Couthon, paralysed from the waist down and unable to climb the scaffold, had to be carried up by the executioner. Paris celebrated. Thermidor, the month of heat, became the name for the reaction, the collective exhale of a nation that had been holding its breath through a year of organised death. The prisons opened. The surviving Girondins returned. The Jacobin Club was closed. The Revolutionary Tribunal was reformed. The terror was over. More than 2 centuries later, historians still argue about the terror. Was it the inevitable product of the revolution's own logic, of the claim to speak for the people, of the rejection of any institutional check on popular sovereignty? Was it the product of a specific emergency, real military crisis, real economic collapse, real counter-revolutionary threat that would not have existed without the wars? Was it the work of a small group of ideologically driven men who hijacked a revolution that could have gone differently? The honest answer is that it was all of these, inseparably entangled. The revolution had proclaimed absolute principles, the rights of man, the sovereignty of the people, the elimination of privilege, that could not be partially fulfilled. Any compromise looked like betrayal. any dissent looked like treason. The war made the stakes existential, and existential stakes make extreme measures feel justified. And the men who ran the Committee of Public Safety were not cynics using ideology as cover for personal ambition. They were true believers, and true believers are more dangerous than cynics, because they never stop to calculate whether what they're doing is worth the cost. What the terror left behind was something more permanent than its own death toll. It left a scar on France and on the idea of revolution itself. Every subsequent revolutionary movement would have to wrestle with the question the terror had posed. What happens when a revolution dedicated to the liberation of humanity begins killing the humans who make it up? When the logic of virtue becomes indistinguishable from the logic of extermination? There was no clean answer. There still isn't. Robespierre had believed in the Republic of Virtue right up to the moment the blade fell. That is the most honest thing that can be said about him. He never wavered. He died for what he believed. The question is whether that makes it better or worse. Chapter 6. The Long Shadow of the Guillotine. Picture the cobblestones of the Place de la Révolution on the morning of the 29th of July, 1794. The blade of the guillotine has just fallen on Maximilien Robespierre. The architect of the terror is dead. The crowds, who for months had gathered to watch the daily executions in a state of terrified hypnosis, now erupt into deafening cheers. It feels like waking up from a suffocating nightmare. People hug in the streets. Prisoners who were scheduled to die that very afternoon weep in their cells. But when the cheering finally fades and the blood is washed from the square, France looks around and realizes a chilling truth. Waking up from a nightmare doesn't mean your house isn't still on fire. This is the era of the revolution that most textbooks rush through. They jump straight from the dramatic fall of Robespierre to the spectacular rise of Napoleon, treating the 5 years in between as a boring waiting room of history. But you cannot understand how a nation founded on the radical idea of pure liberty willingly surrendered itself to a military dictator unless you understand the agonizing hangover of the years between 1794 and 1799. Because history teaches us a brutal lesson here. Exhaustion is the ultimate enemy of idealism. When a society is pushed past its breaking point, when its citizens have lived in a state of absolute adrenaline, fear, and ideological purity for too long, they don't crave liberty anymore. They crave order. They crave normalcy. They just want to survive the winter. The men who overthrew Robespierre were not a group of noble moderates trying to save democracy. Many of them were terrorists themselves, men who had blood up to their elbows and only turned on Robespierre because they realized they were next on his hit list. They were survivors. And once they took power, their only political philosophy was simple: keep surviving and keep getting rich. This period is known as the Thermidorian reaction, and it was defined by a massive violent whiplash. Suddenly, being a radical Jacobin wasn't just out of fashion, it was a death sentence. The pendulum swung violently to the right. Lotta and gangs of wealthy, fashionable young men, known as the Muscadins, or the Gilded Youth, roamed the streets of Paris, armed with heavy wooden clubs, hunting down and beating anyone who looked or sounded like a former radical. In the provinces, a white terror erupted, where victims of the previous regime formed death squads to murder former revolutionaries in their homes and prison cells. It was a cycle of vengeance without end. In the midst of this chaos, the survivors in Paris sat down to write a new constitution. They looked at the ruins of the past 5 years and concluded that the problem was concentrated power. A king had too much power, so he became a tyrant. The Committee of Public Safety had too much power, so they became butchers. So, they designed a government explicitly engineered to be weak. They called it the Directory. Executive power was split among 5 men, the directors, who were constantly rotated and checked by a convoluted 2-house legislature. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic gridlock. It was built to ensure that no single man could ever dominate France again. But in their obsession with preventing another tyrant, they created a government entirely incapable of actually governing. Imagine trying to steer a sinking ship while 5 different captains are arguing over the wheel and the crew is fighting over the lifeboats. That was the Directory. Under their watch, the French economy didn't just stumble, it completely disintegrated. The revolutionary paper money, the assignats, lost 99% of its value. You needed a wheelbarrow of cash to buy a single loaf of firewood. People stripped the bark off trees just to have something to boil. In the freezing winter of 1795, people were literally dropping dead of starvation on the streets of Paris. And here is where the ultimate irony of the revolution crystallized. This was a revolution launched in the name of equality. Yet, under the Directory, the gap between the rich and the poor became wider and more vulgar than it had been under King Louis XVI. A new class of speculators had emerged, men who had bought confiscated church lands for pennies, army contractors who had embezzled military funds, corrupt politicians skimming off the top, while the poor froze these nouveau riches through lavish, perverse parties. They even hosted victims' balls, where the guests, who all claimed to have lost relatives to the guillotine, wore red ribbons tied around their necks to mock the slice of the blade, dancing the night away in extravagant silks while starving citizens pressed their faces against the frosty windows. The moral foundation of the Republic had rotted away. The people no longer believed in the government. The government didn't even believe in itself. So how did the Directory survive for 5 years? How did this corrupt, paralysed system not collapse immediately? Because of one institution. The only institution in France that still functioned. The only institution that still knew how to win. The army. While politicians in Paris were busy taking bribes and attending balls, the French military out on the frontiers had evolved into an unstoppable war machine. The patriotic citizen soldiers of 1792 had transformed into hardened, professional veterans. They were no longer fighting to defend the abstract ideals of the Republic. They were fighting for loot. They were fighting for glory. And most importantly, they were fighting for their generals. A dangerous shift had occurred. A soldier marching in Italy or Germany wasn't being paid by the bankrupt government in Paris. He was being paid with the gold his general confiscated from conquered cities. His loyalty shifted from the nation to the commander who led him. The Directory knew this. They knew they were sitting on a powder keg. They were terrified of their own generals, yet they were utterly dependent on them, because every time the starving people of Paris rioted, or every time the royalists tried to stage a coup, the politicians had to call in the army to shoot their own citizens and keep the government in power. The moment a civilian government admits it can only survive by hiding behind the bayonets of its soldiers, it has already signed its own death warrant. It is no longer a question of if a military dictator will take over, but who. And in October 1795, the universe provided the who. A massive mob of royalists and frustrated citizens marched on the government headquarters in Paris, intent on overthrowing the Directory once and for all. The politicians panicked. The commander of the defense forces realized he needed someone ruthless, someone who wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger on French citizens. He found a 26-year-old artillery officer, a man who was currently unemployed, sleeping on a cot in a cheap room, and so poor his uniform was practically falling apart. He was an outsider, a Corsican who spoke French with a weird accent. But he understood one thing better than anyone else in Paris: the mathematics of power. When asked if he could defend the government, he didn't offer a passionate speech about saving the Republic. He simply demanded complete tactical control. He positioned cannons loaded with grape shot, canisters filled with hundreds of musket balls at the choke points of the city. When the mob advanced, he didn't negotiate. He didn't fire a warning shot. He simply ordered his men to fire directly into the dense crowd. Boom! The streets ran red. The rebellion was shattered in minutes. The young officer later coldly described it as giving the mob a whiff of grape shot. The Directory was saved. The politicians breathed a sigh of relief and patted themselves on the back, believing they had successfully used this scrawny, intense young soldier as a convenient tool. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. They thought they had found a guard dog. They didn't realize they had just handed the keys of the nation to a wolf. The revolution of the politicians was over. The era of the sword had begun, and the name of that 26-year-old artillery officer was Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 7. Napoleon, the revolution's greatest heir and betrayer. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a Parisian who stormed the Bastille in the blistering summer of 1789. You risked your life to tear down the walls of absolute tyranny. You watched a king lose his head to prove that no man is above the nation. You survived the paranoid bloodbath of the Terror. You endured the freezing, starving winters of the Directory. Now, fast forward 15 years. It is the 2nd of December, 1804. You are standing in the freezing cold outside the majestic doors of Notre Dame Cathedral. Inside, surrounded by velvet, gold, and clouds of incense, a 35-year-old man from a minor Corsican family takes a jeweled crown from the hands of the Pope and places it squarely upon his own head. He declares himself Emperor of the French. You look around at the cheering crowds, at the new aristocrats parading in their silk robes, and you have to ask yourself a terrifying, heartbreaking question. Did we kill one king just to build a throne for an even more powerful one? Did a million Frenchmen die in the revolution just so we could end up right back where we started? To answer that question, you have to understand the most brilliant, dangerous, and contradictory figure of the modern age, Napoleon Bonaparte. He is the ultimate paradox. He is the man who saved the French Revolution, and he is the man who murdered it. When Napoleon seized power in the bloodless coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, he did not conquer France. France practically handed him the keys. Why? Because the nation was completely, fundamentally exhausted. By 1799, the grand, intoxicating dreams of 1789 had burned themselves out. The French people no longer woke up talking about the rights of man or the philosophy of Rousseau. They woke up worrying about whether the currency in their pockets would be worthless by sunset, whether the roads were safe from bandits, and whether the corrupt politicians in Paris would start another round of executions. They didn't want radical liberty anymore. They wanted order. They wanted an end to the dizzying anxiety of the past decade. Napoleon understood this perfectly. He stepped onto the stage, not as a tyrant, but as the ultimate CEO of a bankrupt nation. And his first years in power were nothing short of miraculous. He stabilized the economy by creating the Bank of France. He rebuilt the shattered infrastructure, paving roads and digging canals. He ended the bitter, decade-long war with the Catholic Church, signing an agreement with the Pope that brought Sunday bells back to French villages, giving the peasants back their spiritual comfort without giving the church back its confiscated lands. But his greatest masterpiece wasn't a military victory, it was a book. Before the revolution, France was a patchwork nightmare of over 300 different legal systems. A crime in Paris might be legal in a village 50 miles away. The revolution had tried to fix this, and failed. Napoleon locked a group of brilliant lawyers in a room and pushed them relentlessly until they produced the Napoleonic Code. This single document permanently changed the world. The code took the wildest, most chaotic ideals of the revolution and poured them into concrete. It declared that all male citizens were equal before the law. It completely abolished feudalism. It guaranteed property rights. It established a society based on merit, meaning that for the first time in history, a shoemaker's son could rise to become a judge, a government minister, or a marshal of the empire, purely based on his talent and hard work. Bloodlines no longer mattered. In this sense, Napoleon was the revolution's greatest heir. If the revolution was a raging wildfire, Napoleon was the furnace. He captured its raw, destructive energy, contained it, and used it to forge the modern state. He made the destruction of the old regime permanent. No matter what happened after him, nobody could ever put the feudal genie back in the bottle. But there was a dark, heavy price for this stability. It was a devil's bargain. Napoleon gave the French people equality, but he demanded their liberty in return. He despised the messy, noisy, chaotic debates of democracy. He believed the people needed to be directed, not listened to. The vibrant free press of the revolution, which once boasted hundreds of newspapers, was ruthlessly shut down until only a handful of state-approved propaganda sheets remained. He established a vast, shadowy network of secret police under his minister Joseph Fouché, planting spies in cafes, theatres, and even private drawing rooms. He claimed to be the champion of human rights, yet in a move of profound betrayal, he reinstated slavery in the French Caribbean colonies, triggering a brutal and ultimately doomed war against the freedom fighters of Haiti, led by Toussaint Louverture. And then there was the empire. Napoleon didn't just crown himself. He created a brand new aristocracy to replace the one the guillotine had wiped out. He made his brothers and sisters kings and queens of conquered nations across Europe. He He surrounded himself with the pomp and theatrical vanity of a Roman emperor. The man who had once been the sword of the Republic had become a monarch more absolute, more centralized, and more powerful than Louis XVI could have ever imagined. He had assassinated the political soul of the revolution to satisfy his own boundless ego. Yet, Europe could not ignore him. Because Napoleon didn't just rule France, he weaponized it. For the next 10 years, he took this strange, contradictory package, equality without liberty, revolution wrapped in imperialism, and exported it across the continent at the point of a bayonet. His armies were unstoppable. At Austerlitz, at Jena, at Friedland, he didn't just defeat the ancient, aristocratic empires of Austria, Prussia, and Russia, he humiliated them. He shattered the myth of royal invincibility. But here is the ultimate irony of the Napoleonic Wars. The kings of Europe thought they were fighting a man, or at most, a greedy nation. They didn't realize they were fighting an infectious idea. Wherever the French armies marched, they brought the virus of the revolution with them. Even as Napoleon looted their art and taxed their citizens, his administrators were busy tearing down the old world. In Germany, Italy and Spain, they smashed the medieval guilds. They abolished the brutal Spanish Inquisition. They knocked down the walls of the Jewish ghettos. They imposed the Napoleonic Code, suddenly introducing millions of ordinary Europeans to the concept that they had legal rights, that they were not just property of their local lords. Napoleon the Conqueror was simultaneously Napoleon the Liberator. He awakened a sleeping giant. By marching across the continent, he accidentally sparked the fires of nationalism. Germans and Italians looked at the French, saw the terrifying power of a unified nation fighting for a single flag, and began to ask themselves, why can't we do that? Eventually, his ambition outran his genius. The disastrous freezing march into the heart of Russia in 1812 cost him his army. The endless, bleeding guerrilla war in Spain drained his treasury. The combined weight of a terrified Europe finally crushed him. By 1815, after a final desperate gamble at a muddy crossroads in Belgium called Waterloo, the emperor was defeated. He was shipped off to die on a miserable, wind-swept rock in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, a prisoner of the British. The kings of Europe breathed a sigh of relief. They gathered in Vienna, dusted off their crowns, and redrew the borders. They put a Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, the brother of the beheaded Louis XVI, back on the throne of France. They tried to pretend the last 25 years had just been a terrible nightmare. They tried to turn back the clock to 1788, but you cannot unring a bell. Napoleon had permanently broken the old world. The monarchs who sat back on their thrones quickly realized they were sitting on top of volcanoes. The minds of the people had been irrevocably changed. As the dust settled over Europe, a profound silence fell over France. The emperor was gone. The king had returned. The revolution was officially over. And as you look back at the decades of blood, the shattered Bastille, the rolling heads, the glorious victories, and the devastating defeats, a final, lingering question remains. What did it all mean? When the smoke finally cleared, what exactly did the French Revolution leave behind? Chapter 8. What the Revolution Left Behind. When the Bourbon kings finally returned to the throne of France in 1815, they tried desperately to pretend that the previous 25 years had never happened. They scrubbed the revolutionary slogans from the walls of Paris. They tore down the statues of the Republic. They ordered the history books to be rewritten, framing the revolution and Napoleon as nothing more than a temporary, tragic nightmare. But you cannot uninvent fire, and you certainly cannot tell millions of people who have tasted the intoxicating wine of absolute equality to simply go back to being obedient peasants. The physical revolution, the one of guillotines, marching armies, and roaring mobs, was over. But the psychological revolution had only just begun. It had escaped the borders of France, escaped the containment of the kings, and infected the entire world. If you want to know what the French Revolution actually left behind, you don't need to look in a museum. You just need to look at the world you live in right now. Because virtually everything we understand about modern politics, modern society, and even how we measure reality itself was forged in the fires of that single, chaotic decade. Let's start with something you probably hear every single day on the news. Have you ever wondered why we call politicians left-wing or right-wing? That isn't a universal law of nature. It started as a seating arrangement. Back in the summer of 1789, when the newly formed National Assembly was trying to figure out how much power the king should keep, they physically split the room. The men who wanted to preserve tradition, order, and the monarchy sat on the right side of the president's chair. The men who wanted radical change, sweeping reforms, and power for the people gathered on the left. That simple, accidental geography of a single room in Paris permanently defined the political spectrum of the human race. Every time you vote, every time you argue about politics, you are unknowingly participating in a debate that started over 2 centuries ago in a sweaty, crowded hall in France. But the revolution gave us something much deeper than just political labels. It gave us a fundamentally new definition of what a human being actually is. Before 1789, your worth as a person was dictated entirely by your bloodline. You were born a noble, or you were born a commoner, and that was it. The system was ordained by God. But when the revolutionaries drafted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, they did something intellectually explosive. They declared that rights are not privileges granted by a generous king. They are inherent. You are born with them. They belong to you simply because you exist. It is the blueprint for every modern democracy. It is the invisible shield that protects you from the absolute power of the state. Even if modern governments often fail to live up to that ideal, the French Revolution established the baseline. The government serves the people, not the other way around. And speaking of the people, the revolution entirely reinvented why we fight and die for our countries. For centuries, wars were personal disputes between kings. You fought for the King of France or the King of England. But when the European monarchies invaded France to crush the revolution, the French government didn't have a king to fight for. So, they invented something new: nationalism. They told the blacksmiths, the bakers, and the farmers, "You are not fighting for a man who sits on a throne. You are fighting for your own liberty. You are fighting for la patrie, the fatherland. This nation belongs to you." This concept of the citizen soldier changed the mathematics of war forever. It allowed France to field armies of 1 million men, driven by patriotic passion rather than a meagre paycheck. Nationalism became the most powerful and the most dangerous force of the 19th and 20th centuries. It built incredible empires, and it started world wars. And it all began when the French decided that the nation was greater than the crown. Yet, for all its glorious achievements, human rights, equality before the law, the destruction of feudalism, we cannot look at the legacy of the French Revolution without confronting its darkest, most terrifying shadow. The revolution provided the ultimate template for how to overthrow an oppressive system, but it also provided the ultimate template for how a fight for freedom can seamlessly morph into a nightmare of totalitarian terror. Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety proved a chilling truth about human nature. There is nothing more dangerous than a man who is absolutely convinced of his own moral purity. They taught future generations of extremists that if your goal is a perfect society, then any amount of violence is justified to achieve it. Every major revolution that followed, from the Russian Revolution in 1917 to the upheavals of the 20th century, studied the French playbook. They all started with the soaring promises of 1789, and tragically, almost all of them ended up in the bloody paranoia of 1794, culminating in the rise of a strongman who promised to restore order at the cost of liberty. The French Revolution proved that tearing down an old world is surprisingly easy. Building a new one without drowning in blood is almost impossible. So, as we bring this story to a close, let's go back to that bewildered French citizen standing in the freezing cold in 1804, watching Napoleon crown himself emperor, wondering if it was all for nothing. Was it a failure? In the short term, yes. The revolution ate its own children. It collapsed into dictatorship. It devastated a continent. But in the long arc of history, it changed the DNA of human civilization. The genie of equality was out of the bottle. The kings of Europe eventually got their thrones back, but they never got their absolute power back. They ruled over a changed species, citizens who knew that they could, if pushed too far, bring down 1,000-year-old monarchy in a single afternoon. The French Revolution is not just a chapter in a dusty textbook, it is a mirror. When you look into it, you see the absolute best and the absolute worst of what humanity is capable of. You see the breathtaking courage of ordinary people demanding dignity. You see the terrifying ease with which righteous anger turns into mass murder. You see the eternal, agonizing tug of war between our desire for absolute freedom and our desperate need for safety and order. The story of the French Revolution is the story of us. It is the agonizing, bloody, beautiful birth of the modern world. So the next time you hear a politician make a promise they can't keep, or see a crowd marching in the streets demanding justice, or wonder just how fragile the society around you really is, remember the cobblestones of Paris. Remember the fall of the Bastille. Remember the shadow of the guillotine, because the revolution never really ended. We are all just living in its aftermath. Good night.